So let's see, we have Lab 2 due tomorrow, right? Am I in the right week here? Lab 2 due tomorrow. You can use it late if you want. I'll post homework 3 probably like tomorrow. That'll be due next week. And then there'll be another homework after that, homework 4. Lab 3 won't happen for a while. So Lab 3 is the first of the design labs. So Labs 1 and 2 are the two kind of like, you know, characterize the channel, get comfortable with the channel and so on. Lab 3 is the first one where we actually design communication systems. So that one's a few weeks off still. There's recitation tomorrow, discussion I guess it's called technically. And yeah, that's it. That's where we're at. Any questions? Yeah.
What lab does partnered lab start with?
4. Yeah. So I think it's good for everyone to do like the basic design thing on your own, and then starting with 4 and 5, you can work with a partner if you want. Let me just say, I'll say this again when Lab 4 comes out, but let me just say it now in case you're kind of planning teams and stuff. Like it's in my mind, it's totally doable to do Labs 4 and 5 individually. Okay, I've designed them so that it's possible to do that, and people do that. So in prior years, I've always have, you know, a few people who just do it on their own. And they often come up with designs that are quite competitive. Okay, so for the standard, I guess, was it last year? I guess it was actually this spring of 2016. Like one of the 2 teams that presented their standard to the class was actually an individual who did it all by himself. So, so don't feel like the labs 4 and 5 are like so much work that you've got to team up with someone to possibly get it done. Like it's not that way at all. So you can do it on your own. Lab 3, on the other hand, has to be done by everyone individually. Yeah, other questions? We good? Okay. So today I'm hoping to finish modeling the channel. And so hopefully by the end of today's lecture, we'll have just an end-to-end model for how, you know, a wave file in gets mapped to a wave file out. Once we have a model for that, starting next week, we'll talk about how to communicate over channels like that, okay? And so the intro I gave to this unit is that, like, since the design space for this problem is so huge, like the set of all, like, encoders, a set of all maps from like long binary strings to like long wave files. So that's just a huge design space, and it's not really clear. It's too big to just sort of experimentally try to explore it, and it's also not really even clear where to start. So rather than cutting, you know, directly to kind of like experimentation, people usually find it helpful to develop a math model of the channel first, do some math to try to get a sense of what the good designs are, okay? And you kind of narrow the space, the design space down somewhat, okay? And then you sort of experimentally optimize it in that remaining space, okay? So this is sort of by necessity to develop a math model because the space is just too big to really optimize over otherwise. So this is the channel in block diagram form. So I'll run through it again. We did this last time, but you start with bits to transmit. Okay, and remember we have this separation theorem, if you recall, from the first lecture that says that you can, if you want to send like an image or a sound or whatever, that you can, without any loss of performance, you can reduce the sound or the image just a bit stream, send the bit stream over the channel so it's recovered, and then like reconstruct your source from the bit stream. That's without loss of optimality. So we're kind of relying on that here. We're not really considering what we're trying to really transmit in the end. Is it music? Is it audio? Is it speech, text, whatever? We just say we have bits to send. Okay, so you have bits to send. We're going to design these 2 boxes. So one is the encoder. It's going to map bits to wave files, to audio samples. Okay, it's going to pass through a bunch of boxes before it gets to the other side. Okay, so it's going to get quantized first. This is like rounding, reduced precision. This you can think of as almost just like calling audio right to save your audio samples as a wave file. It'll reduce precision when you do that. These are typically like, you know, you do FFTs and stuff when you design your encoder, and you end up with like these double precision samples, and you save them to a wave file that you reduce to like 60-bit precision or 24 or whatever. Okay, so you have audio samples now that are take one of, you know, 2 to 24 different values. Okay, you pass that into the sound card on the COM cloud. And it interpolates from discrete time to continuous time, so you get a continuous time waveform, okay? That's amplified. This is like a headphone amplifier, basically. Okay, so it's amplified. You now have like a strong continuous time signal as opposed to a weak continuous time signal. Okay, it gets passed through our filter, and that, I said we call that the channel proper, whereas like everything between the encoder and decoder we call the channel. So it passes through the filter, the little RLC filter we have. This is the underdamped thing that resonates at like, you know, 7.5 kilohertz, thereabouts. Okay, all of that we call the transmitter. So everything up to this point, up to the channel proper, we call the transmitter. All right, the output of the channel proper goes into what we call the receiver. Receiver has many blocks in it. Okay, so more amplification. Basically, you want to take it now from a continuous time voltage waveform to like, discrete audio samples. So you amplify, you got a sample, filter and sample. We'll talk about what exactly happens in this box. So reduce to discrete time. You're going to quantize again. You have like continuous amplitudes here. They got to be reduced to something you can represent in MATLAB, so fixed precision. And then you get audio samples. And then we're going to design this box here. It's going to take these audio samples and reconstruct the bits from it. Okay? So as I mentioned last time, from our perspective, we're designing these two boxes, like in some sense, everything between the two boxes is like the channel, right? A particular impairment, a particular source of noise, and it almost doesn't matter if it crops up here, here, here. I mean, it doesn't really matter to us, right? All we care about is the end-to-end behavior from here to here. Because that's why we call everything from X to Y the channel. And we call this a channel proper to distinguish it from the channel, okay? And it's just worthwhile to remember that parts of what we call the channel are actually electronics in the transmitter. Okay, so the amplifier, the DAC, it's all electronics in the transmitter. Likewise, the ADC amplifier here, the quantizer. This is like electronics in the receiver. But we call that the channel because it's effectively is part of the channel for us. It's an impairment, from this signal to this signal. Okay, so we're going to develop a model that from here to here. So I want a math model that says, like, if I have a particular x vector, how exactly does it get transformed into a y vector here? Okay, and then we can kind of, once we have that math model written down, we can kind of like pull it apart and look at good ways of embedding bits into these audio samples in a way that you can pull them out over here. Okay, so we want a math model for the whole thing. We're going to do it kind of step by step, building outward. So just start with a math model for just this part. Suppose you had no other components of the system. You just had the filter. How would you model that? And then we'll add blocks slowly until we get here. Okay, I shouldn't say slowly. Some of the blocks throw in quite easily. Okay, so modeling the channel proper, that's the filter. So this is an RLC filter. I gave you the schematic last lecture on Tuesday. And I said you can well model it as like an LTI system with noise added onto it. Okay, and this part you're probably quite comfortable with. This is the sort of thing you study in like 2100, right, or 2200. Like, how do you just measure the impulse response or compute the impulse response of an RLC filter and then express the I/O relationship as a convolution. So that I assume people are pretty comfortable with. The noise term is something that's probably new as of this class, okay, and that classes like 2100, 2200, you wouldn't really consider the noise term. You just sort of ignore it and just look at the deterministic effects alone. Okay, I mentioned the noise term is really important for us, though. That's what governs how much data you can actually push through the channel, like what data rates you can actually sustain. Okay, so we can't ignore it. So I spent a good chunk of last lecture talking about the noise and where it comes from physically. I said there were basically two types of noise in an RLC filter like this: thermal noise, shot noise, and we modeled them both. And so what remains is to kind of deduce from these two things how to, like, what distribution to pick for Z, and then we'll go on to the next block. Okay, so that's where we left off. Any questions? People with me? Okay. So we need to pick a distribution for Z, given the physics we talked about on Tuesday, thermal noise, shot noise. Okay, so let's write Z is having two parts. You have the thermal noise, and you have the shot noise, right? So T for thermal, S for shot. Okay, and we want a distribution for each of these. So which distribution should we pick? So Zt of T, the thermal noise term, turns out to be extremely well modeled by a Gaussian distribution. Okay, and this is from a central limit theorem argument. So people seen the central limit theorem? You heard of it? Yeah. I mean, you add up a bunch of independent, small independent random quantities, add them together, the sum tends to look Gaussian. Okay, this is my like English hand-wavy version of the central limit theorem. Okay, so thermal noise comes about from just the thermal motion of all these electrons. They each are charged, so when they move, they create a small current. And what you observe is like the superposition of like all of these little movements, right? So the individual movements are roughly independent. Of course, they collide and stuff, but there's a huge number of them. They're mostly independent. You observe the sum of all these things. So central limit theorem gives you the Gaussian distribution. Okay, this is like almost like a. It'd be hard to come up with a better physical scenario where you could apply the central limit theorem, okay, because you have like so many electrons and they're so decoupled and linear, so linear, you know. So anyway, very well modeled by the Gaussian distribution. That's easy. We saw last time the shot noise is, you can think of it as like a Poisson random variable times some small constant. I'll write epsilon here. So epsilon's a small constant. Okay, we worked out what epsilon is last time. You know, it's a function of the capacitance. It's a function of the charge of an electron. But anyway, the point is you get n times epsilon, where n is a Poisson lambda random variable. So Poisson random variable is integer valued. Okay, so think about taking a realization of the Poisson random variable. You get some integer. You multiply it by this really small constant. Okay, and you end up with, you know, a real number, a voltage. Okay, you can almost, you know, if the Poisson random variable is large mean and epsilon's really small, this can almost look like kind of a real valued random variable, okay, because the epsilon step sizes are really small, okay? Okay, so our noise is the sum of these two, right? So we got sum of like Gaussian plus scaled Poisson, right? That doesn't seem like it's gonna have a nice answer, right? Gaussian plus like independent Poisson scaled. You got like a continuous and a discrete random variable added together, right? Potentially kind of messy. Potentially. Okay, in practice, we just model the whole thing by Gaussian. Okay, so just like ignore the Poisson part. And there are a couple of justifications that one can give for this. So one is, as I mentioned last time, many systems are thermal noise limited. Okay, so the thermal noise dominates over the shot noise. Okay, so in that case, you can just sort of ignore the shot noise and just say this is really the dominant term, so who cares about that? Thermal noise is Gaussian, done. Our system, if you remember, however, is not thermal noise limited, it's shot noise limited. Okay, so we can't get away with quite such a simple argument. But we can still argue that this should be approximately Poisson, okay, because it turns out that n epsilon, when lambda, the parameter of the Poisson distribution here, when lambda is large, and epsilon is small, is approximately Gaussian itself. Okay, so a Poisson random variable with a really large mean that's scaled down by some small number epsilon will also look Gaussian. Okay, so I think this is like one of the calculations Umair plans to do tomorrow is, you know, if you're curious on how to show that, one of the things he plans to do. I mentioned last time the Poisson distribution can be derived from the binomial distribution, right? I think hopefully you can see how the Gaussian distribution would arise from the binomial, right? Because binomial is the sum of Bernoulli random variables, right? It's like, you know, it counts how many heads do you get in n flips when you have probability of p of getting a heads, right? So for each flip, you can have like a binary random variable, 0 or 1, whether you get heads or not, okay? And the binomial is just the sum of those things. So the binomial is a sum of a bunch of independent things. Okay, so you already see how, like in a certain regime, the binomial would start to look Gaussian, right? Like in a large n, certain large n regime. If you scale it, it's got kind of the right underlying dynamics to give you a Gaussian distribution. The Poisson distribution is derived from the binomial. Okay, so you can sort of see how Poisson might inherit a kind of a Gaussianity in a certain asymptotic limit. Okay, and it does. Okay, so we had numbers last time. Indeed, you know, epsilon's really small for us. Lambda's really big. Okay, so you can, for our case, we probably argue it using number 2. Most real world channels are thermal noise limited, so you don't even bother with that. You just use this. Okay. There are, by the way, some niche channels for which you can't argue either 1 or 2. Okay, so they're not thermal noise limited. And at the same time, like the signals are weak enough so that your lambda ends up being not too big. Okay, and so you can't really argue this thing is Gaussian-like. And you're kind of stuck with the Poisson behavior. In that case, though, since it's shot noise limited, you can almost ignore the thermal noise and just have the shot noise, in which case you get this Poisson random variable hanging around. Okay? If you continue on in communications and read papers and stuff, you'll see people refer to Poisson channels. Okay, this is what they're talking about. So Poisson channel is one for which the noise is basically like a Poisson random variable rather than Gaussian. Okay, it's going to come up a lot in optical communications. Not wired, but like free space, like optical, like I have a laser and I shoot at you like that. Okay, I don't quite understand the physics why the shot noise dominates in that case, but that's where they tend to come up. Okay, so bottom line. Our model for the channel proper, which is y, is the input to the channel proper convolved with some impulse response derived from the RLC filter plus noise, where z of t is Gaussian for each t. Okay, and this is a regular convolution right here. By the way, just a bit of notation. So someone asked me about this. So like this versus this. Okay, so I use both notations. In my mind, they mean slightly different things. Okay, so this represents the function x evaluated at a particular time t. Okay, so as a mathematical object, this is like a number. This is like the output of x when the input is t. Okay, this on the other hand refers to x itself as a function. So the mathematical object is a function. Okay, so do you guys still learn C programming? Like, is that something you learn? This is what I had to learn when I was an undergraduate. But how many people know basic C? I could write oh wow, hello world in C. Okay, great. So so in C, I assume this is true in other languages too, but like in C, if you have a function f that takes an integer, like this as a data type, suppose it takes an integer and returns an integer, okay? This as a data type is an integer, right? Wherever an integer can appear, you can put that, okay, and it'll compile. It's a valid integer, right? You can also have a pointer to the function f, right, in memory. Okay, you have a variable that just points to where f is in memory. You can pass that around and operate on it and so on, right? So this is in some sense like the function, the operator on integers, and this is like the output for a particular integer n. Okay. A lot of times in signals classes, people will kind of just mix these two up or just use this all the time. And in many situations, that's safe. That can kind of cause confusion, though, when you start doing more advanced stuff. So I like to separate between the two. Likewise, in discrete time, like this is the whole signal or the whole function of the integers, whereas like this is at a particular time. Okay, so convolution is an operator that operates on signals, right? You give it two signals and it convolves them. You don't give it two numbers, right? You don't convolve 3 and 5, okay? You convolve like two signals, okay? So here's a signal, I convolve them, that gives me another signal, I evaluate that signal at time t, add that to z of t, that's y1 of t. Okay, if you put this in, to me I'd register that as a syntax error because you're trying to convolve two numbers, and the convolution operator doesn't work on numbers, it works on signals. Okay? Sometimes also when the range of the domain is not, like when you want to specify that, sometimes you can refer to the signal like this. That means like the whole signal, not just evaluated at one time, but everything. Okay. Good, so at this point we have a model for the channel proper. So I know how this signal gets translated into this signal. Okay, so far so good. Next step is to add the amplifiers. Okay, this is like trivial given what we've done. Okay, and then we're going to ignore, nonlinear effects in the amplifiers. In which case, the amplifiers behave conceptually at least just like the channel proper. Okay, so the channel proper we modeled as a convolution with added noise, right? An LTI system plus noise, right? This is also reasonable to model as an LTI system plus noise. Okay, it has some impulse response, it's got thermal noise, it's got shot noise. Like we didn't really rely on like the particular structure of this RLC filter. We just had like a circuit here, really. So really, when we did all this analysis here, we modeled like a circuit. So there's a circuit, here's another circuit, here's another circuit. Okay, so to go from x2 to y2, it's kind of the same sort of stuff, just your impulse response is a little bit different. The impulse response is now the composite impulse response of this, this, and this together, rather than that one alone. Okay, but we didn't really work out the impulse response anyway, we just called it some h. So we have the same formula again for x2 to y2, with just potentially a different h. I know I'm talking quickly, and no one's raising their sign. Partly Umair is not here, and he's probably the one to flag it. Okay, so modeling the amps, you have a similar equation. Maybe I should call this Z1 maybe. Is that okay? So there's like the noise process surrounding or originating in the filter, and then we're going to have Z2 of T, which is the noise obtained, you know, the union, if you will, of the noise in the amplifier, the filter, and the other amplifier. Okay? So it's the same structure, just the impulse response has changed because we got more blocks in there. In Z2, we would again model as Gaussian. Okay, so those two are easy. So let's talk about sampling and discrete time, continuous time conversion. Any questions so far? Okay. So this is converting between discrete and continuous time. Yeah.
So here is the impulse response as if the signal is passing through the amp, then the filter, then the amp, or just an amp?
No, that's through all three. Yeah. So it's labeled modeling the amps, but it goes from x2 to y2, which is all three. It's maybe just modeling the amps plus the filter. It doesn't make a great deal of difference in that if this was the model for the amps, then the model for all three together would be the combination of that, which would still have the same form. It's just the H would incorporate more stuff. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. So for this part, we need to recall the sampling theorem. So suppose we have a continuous time signal that's band limited to minus f over 2, f over 2. F is deterministic here. It seems proper to use uppercase for it, but it's not random. It's deterministic. So band limited to minus f over 2 to f over 2. Okay, by which I mean it's continuous time Fourier transform. And let's call it, I don't know, x tilde of f maybe. Is 0 outside the band minus f over 2 to f over 2. Okay, so band limited signal. Okay, then the punchline is you can recover x from its samples spaced 1 over f time units apart. In fact, you can write down in closed form how to recover the full continuous time signal from the samples. So xt you can write as a sum of the samples. So this is x evaluated just the sample points times sinc f t minus n, where sinc is just the usual sine x over x, actually sine pi x over pi x. Okay, so I'm sure you've seen the sampling theorem before. You might not have written out the explicit reconstruction formula, okay, but this gives you a very explicit way of reconstructing x from its samples. Okay, so this is just kind of background. Okay, so like whenever you're talking about converting between discrete time and continuous time, like in these two blocks here, you got to have the sampling theorem kind of in the back of your head. By the way, there's one other conclusion to this that that we will use. So it turns out like the total energy in the discrete time signal is related to the total energy in the continuous time signal. Okay, scaled by f. Okay, I think this is going to be one of the homework problems on homework 3. It kind of walks you through how to show that if you haven't shown that before. And this sort of fact is going to be useful for us because typically in communication systems you have a power constraint. Like you can't just blast arbitrary amounts of power out. I mean, the comm cloud you kind of can. I mean, the amplitudes are limited at -1, +1, but you can send any amplitude between -1 and +1 and nobody cares. Wi-Fi, for instance, you can't just blast arbitrary power on your antenna because you'll kind of impact other people. So it's common to work with a power constraint where like you have to choose x here so that by the time you get all the way over here, this x has no more than a certain amount of power in it. Okay, and this kind of result allows you to translate from one to the other. So you can kind of look at the energy in the continuous time signal related to the energy in the samples with a scaling factor. So ultimately, we're going to be picking something close to this, like the discrete time samples, and something more close to this is what actually goes out like over an antenna. So you need to relate the two. So this formula gives you a way of doing that. Okay. Okay, so that's just background. So let's talk about the two boxes now. We'll actually do the discrete time to continuous time one first. It's the more complicated of the two. So let's talk about how to model this translation. All right, this is the DAC, right? So this is basically an interpolation problem, right? So if you think about, place yourself in the shoes of the engineer who's going to design this box. Okay, you're going to get samples, and you got to output a continuous time signal, right? So how would you do that? So what's specified to you are these like discrete amplitudes, discretely spaced amplitudes. Okay, that's your input. Okay, and you got to like connect the dots somehow. Okay, that's your problem. So how to do that, how to connect the dots. And let me be clear here, we're not designing this, right? This is baked into the sound card electronics, okay? So ultimately we're designing these, okay? So right now we're just talking about like how these things work so we can understand them and then model them. So we're not ultimately designing them, but it's useful to just put yourself in the shoes of the engineer who designs that. Okay, so, we want, these white dots, they specify like, x, a discrete time signal, and then somehow we want to go from that to, a continuous time signal. And the question is, like, how do you construct this kind of mapping that takes a discrete time signal and then maps it to a continuous time signal like that? OK, so let me write down a list of 3 what I call reasonable requirements of this mapping that I argue like any reasonable choice for the interpolator should satisfy. Number 1, this is actually like probably the weakest of the 3, the one that's most debatable. Number 1, it should be linear. Sorry, discrete time to continuous time. Should be linear. Okay, so you scale up the input, you just scale up the continuous time waveform. It shouldn't suddenly change, shape beyond just a scaling up of the whole thing. Okay, you take 2 signals, 2 discrete time signals, add them up. Okay, the interpolation of the sum should be the sum of the interpolations. It's reasonable. You can quibble as to whether or not that's really necessary, but that's reasonable. The second one I think is just indisputable. It should be time invariant. Meaning delaying the discrete time signal by 1 sample should do what? Delay what?
Oh, it should delay the continuous time
By what? I'm just going to write while we think here. Should delay continuous time by how much? 1 over f, right? Okay. So if we just hand to this interpolation operator, if we just hand it, the same white dots just shifted 1 sample over, then the red line should just be shifted over by 1 over f. Okay, it shouldn't suddenly say, oh, now we're going to completely change how we interpolate it. We're going to do like a rigid, like linear interpolation instead of a curvy thing. Okay, it should just shift it. And number 3 is actually the most indisputable one. I think 3, 1 you can maybe debate a little bit. 1 is more debatable. 3 is not debatable at all. Let me actually pose it to you. What would you make as the 3rd requirement, the 3rd axiom? What are we missing here? Beautiful. Yes. Let me point out that here's a simple interpolator. I just always output 0. Okay? I just always do this. Whatever your samples are, that's my output, right? That satisfies 1, that satisfies 2. Right? Not very useful. Okay, it's not actually using. We haven't actually constrained the thing to use the dots in any substantial way. So we'll do that right now. So it's got to run through, pass through the dots. Okay, so x n over f should equal x discrete time at n for all n. Okay? All right, so it turns out if your interpolation satisfies 1, 2, and 3, then it has to have a very structured form to it. So any interpolator satisfying 1, 2, and 3 it must have the following form. So the continuous time signal x of t, okay, it must be possible to write that as just like the same pulse, just shifted and summed, scaled by the sample values. Okay, so it must be expressible as sum over n x n g of f t minus n. for some fixed pulse, fixed meaning doesn't depend on the samples x. Satisfying. If I just leave this here, it's sort of not necessarily very interesting, but or as useful. But you can actually show a bit more that g has to be 1 at 0, and 0 if n equals like plus minus 1, plus minus 2, etc. Okay, so let me be clear here. G is a continuous time signal, okay, and I'm evaluating it at the integers, okay? So think of it as a pulse, and if you evaluate at 0, at 1, at 2, it's got to be 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. I mean, at all integers it's 0 except for 0 where it's 1, okay? But then off the integers, this theorem says nothing about it. It could be anything off the integers. At the integers, though, it's got to have this pattern to it, okay? So this reduces the design space a lot, right? So if you're designing your interpolator, as long as you're satisfying 1 through 3, you're pretty much just picking a G. So the whole design problem boils down to just picking this G. Once you pick the G, then the interpolation's done, right? All right. So what are some choices for G? What would be a valid choice for G? Yeah.
I'm tempted to say that that odd delta function that we've been using for a long time.
That,
1 at 0 and 0 runs.
so we want a continuous time signal, right?
Delta necessarily discrete.
I mean, you could have a continuous time. I mean, exists such a thing as a continuous time delta function, but you normally think of it as like kind of a narrow pulse with area 1 rather than amplitude 1. So then at 0, its amplitude is actually really big. Yeah.
You could have like a sample and hold type thing.
Uh-huh. Like that. That's certainly a valid G. It's a continuous time signal. It's 1 at time 0. It's 0 at all other integer times. I shouldn't have erased the plot here. Okay, but that would, if you interpolate using this G, you basically get something like this. Okay, and if you shift the rectangle so it's not symmetric about 0, then you can get it so it's it does more like that. Yeah.
Is that 0 order hold?
Yeah, they call it like a 0 order hold. Yes. All right. That's one choice. This choice has certain advantages and certain disadvantages. What do you think? Advantage, disadvantage? Bless you. Yeah. Sorry? Non-causal. Yeah, just barely. It's just, I guess I'll say if you want to see non-causal, wait until we do number 2. Okay. So it is strictly speaking non-causal. I mean, I could maybe if I just consider rect delayed by a little bit so that you have that, then it would be causal, right? like that. Yeah.
You have these like really sharp, discrete jumps.
Uh-huh. And why is that a problem?
Because most electrical circuitry is like band limited, and so you'll have like the little overshoot thing.
Okay. Yeah, so it's hard to implement it, you know, in this like really exaggerated form. It's kind of hard to implement. Another way of looking at kind of the same thing is that like even if you could implement this with high fidelity so that your signal kind of did look like this, or kind of very abruptly changed. In the frequency domain, you're going to get like kind of long tails. Like the bandwidth of the continuous time signal I get with this interpolation is going to be quite high because I got all these abrupt jumps, right? So we'll call that a disadvantage, high bandwidth, large bandwidth. All right, you might ask, well, why do we care about the bandwidth? I mean, what does it matter? So in communication system design, large bandwidths can create problems for a couple of reasons. One is, you know, the channel typically has kind of a natural bandwidth, and outside of that bandwidth, you have bandwidth constraints for potentially a couple of reasons. One is your channel might have a natural bandwidth, and outside of that natural bandwidth, it just sort of eats all the transmit energy, doesn't let it through. Okay, so any energy you input outside of its natural band just gets absorbed as heat in the channel, doesn't make it through to the other side, and it's wasted. Okay, so that's bad. Okay, that's wasting energy, right? And so you'd like your signal to be kind of constrained to the natural bandwidth of the channel so it all gets through. Okay, and if you use an interpolator like that, you end up with a very wide bandwidth, and you have a lot of energy going into bands that the channel just absorbs. Okay, so that's one reason you have a bandwidth constraint. Alternatively, what can happen is that, like, especially in a wireless, you know, like a shared communication medium, you know, you'll be assigned a bandwidth, right? Like, you know, you're a radio station and you have your little band, okay? And it creates a problem if your transmitter is sending energy out in other people's bands, right? You're interfering with them. So you're kind of required to just stick to your band and don't encroach on other people's bands. And then if you use that, okay, you're spewing energy across the band, right? What is the Fourier transform of G? It's a sinc, right? Just rectangular pulse becomes a sinc. Right? And sinc has these very slow tails, right? Decays is like 1/t. Okay, so you have like a really wide band. Okay. Any advantages of this at all? Yeah, okay. It's simple. In particular, I'll point out it has kind of low buffering requirements. Low latency and buffering requirements. Okay, and that, you know, to figure out what the voltage should be at one particular continuous time point, like here, you only need to know like one sample. Okay, you don't really care what the other samples are, right? Only one sample is influencing the interpolation of that time. Whereas like for arbitrary G, you know, X of t could in principle depend on lots of samples, right? But here it's just one. Okay, so you don't have to, like in electronics, you don't have to buffer like large numbers of samples in order to compute what to output right now. So you end up with low buffering requirements, low latency as well. Okay. Give me another option for G. I wish I had like an unerase function on this board. Okay, you can do that. What's G in that case? Like that, right? This is going to have kind of similar advantages and disadvantages as the rectangular pulse. You know, it's less exaggerated though. Okay, so the bandwidth isn't quite as large. It's a little less simple, but similar to rectangular pulse in many regards. Give me another one. So I had one right here that I just erased. Right? What? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this, I guess maybe sync was like over on that board. But I mean, if you look at, the sync reconstruction formula, like perfectly matches the structure of this G interpolation, right? It's just you put sync in place of G. It's just like strongly suggestive, right? That one particular choice of G that you might want to consider would just be sync T. Okay, and that satisfies the requirements, right? It's 1 at 0, it's 0 at all other integer points. Okay, this will give you, kind of a curved interpolation, which is nice. Tell me about advantages and disadvantages. I guess we have multiple here. I can indeed make it plural. Yeah.
Isn't it theoretically completely accurate?
Well, what does accurate mean, I guess? So, sorry? Assuming assuming it is band limited, assuming you want a band limited X. So I mean, the way, the mindset to have with the DAC is like you get these samples, and now you are going to like create a continuous time signal from that. So, I might question the premise that there's like a right answer to that, right? I mean, you're handed like this incomplete function. You get to kind of fill in between the dots, however you like. So I think these are all kind of valid interpolations. They all satisfy the 3 axioms, right? The sync one does have the advantage that if you were targeting like a band limited signal, then this will give you that. How do I express this in terms of like advantages and disadvantages? So the sync and rectangular pulse are like Fourier duals of each other, right? Fourier duals. So like, you see what I'm getting at? Like advantages of one or disadvantages of the other and vice versa. Okay, so the rectangular pulse is simple, has low buffering requirements in the time domain, right? Low latency in the time domain because each continuous time, the signal at one continuous time only depends on one sample and that's it. And it has a large bandwidth, right? So sync is just the exact opposite. Okay, it has a low bandwidth. In fact, it has the lowest possible bandwidth that you can get while still adhering to conditions 1 through 3. On the other hand, not simple to implement in the time domain. Large buffering requirements, okay, in the sense that if this is my signal, when you plot G on its own, you're sort of plotting the influence of one sample in continuous time, right? So this one sample is still influencing the continuous time signal after a long time, right? Okay, so you have kind of high buffering requirements, high latency. So high buffering and latency. But low bandwidth. Okay, in fact, it's the lowest possible bandwidth. Okay, you cannot find another G that will consistently, always give you a lower bandwidth than that. You can't go lower than that. Okay. So as you might expect, in practice, you don't tend to do either one of the 2 extreme points, the rectangular pulse or the sync. You do something kind of in between. There's a whole spectrum of things you can do in between, including the triangular pulse, like the linear interpolation. So this is like first order. In practice, people tend to use what they call a raised cosine pulse. Have you heard of this? Ever seen that string before, raised cosine? No? Yeah. So raised cosine is like kind of a modified sync, but you multiply it by an extra factor to kind of kill it off in time faster. So it's pi beta t over 1 minus 4 beta squared t squared. I guess you have like with the sync, you have kind of 2 cases here. So it's that if that denominator is not 0 and 1 otherwise. So this is if 4 beta squared t squared is equal to 1 otherwise. They call this the raised cosine. Okay, so the idea is it's sink-like, but it'll fall off faster with t than the sink because you got like a t here. Yeah, I know. I agree. I agree. I don't know quite how people settled on that, but like you open up any book on COM or DAC, and like this is what they this is what they put forward. Yeah.
Can you explain the options? Like if you said if 4 beta squared t squared equals 1,
Uh-huh.
but then you're dividing by 0.
Oh, not equal to 1, sorry. Sorry, it's like a sink. It's just,
Okay.
yeah, sorry. Did you have a question? You have the same question maybe? Okay, all right, yeah. Beta is a parameter, by the way. If you choose beta to be 0, you get sink back. Okay, and as you increase beta, you're sort of killing off the sink faster in some sense. So typically I think beta is kind of between 0 and 1 roughly, and you kind of choose a beta to trade off, you know, the latency versus the bandwidth of it. One reason why I think people tend to use this this particular pulse is if you look at the Fourier transform of the sink, ends up being that, right? So this is Fourier transform of sink. Becomes a rectangular pulse, okay? People claim the Fourier transform of that thing ends up like, ignoring the amplitude, it's kind of flat and then just has kind of a rounded corner and then hits 0 and is 0 forever after, like that. Okay, so it's nice and it's still band limited. Okay, it's just band limited to a slightly fatter band. Okay, so ultimately that's probably the reason why they do that particular weird sink with the pi in the denominator and everything, as opposed to lots of other signals you could imagine. Okay, because they still want something where they can kind of like ensure there's like essentially no power outside of a certain band. Okay, how fat these things are depends on beta. So if beta is 0, you just get the sink back. Okay, and then as beta increases, this thing kind of fattens out and fattens out. Okay. So bottom line, if you just relate like x2 to x2 here, like just model the discrete time to continuous time converter, okay, then you can write x2t as sum over x, x2n, g of f t minus n for some pulse g. Okay, so like for our purposes on some level, we didn't really have to go through this list, okay, because we're not really going to use the specific form of g. Okay, we'll just assume that the interpolation is of this form for some g. So we could have actually stopped after the 3 axioms and just said it's of this form, but I want to give you a sense of, you know, what kind of g's people pick and why. And it's part of lab 2, right, is to measure the g on the COM cloud, right? We pulled off the filter on one of the channels so you can measure the g directly without the filter altering it. So you should get something roughly sink-like. If you want to be ambitious, okay, you can, you know, take this formula, plot it, take the FFT, whatever, okay, and then take the COM cloud data and see if it's a better match for this or for this, or better yet, just like, you know, since sync is a special case of this, try to fit the value of beta to the pulse you get. Okay, you can see how close they're doing sync versus like, you know, a really fattened version of sync in the frequency domain like this. Okay, that's not required for the lab. Okay, the lab just says just like, you know, plot it, and is it sync-like or rectangular? It's pretty easy to see it's sync-like if you do it right. But if you want to be more ambitious, you can try to, you know, fit the value of beta. Okay, so we have a model from x2 to x2, right? Discrete time to continuous time. We have a model from x2 continuous time to y2 continuous time, right? So you can compose these two and get a model from here to here. right? So putting these together, y2t we said was x2 in continuous time, convolved with some impulse response h2 at time t plus z2 t, right? So now plug in for this. Plug in for x2. We'll get that y2 is sum over n, x2 of n. I'm going to get the convolution of h2 and g, my pulse. So g of w, sorry, not wf. OK, I'm going to make up some notation right here. I'm going to write it like that. So just view this as a, view this as a function of a real parameter. And if you have a real number, you plug it in there. So if I want to evaluate this function at 5, I do f5 minus n. I want to evaluate at time 0, I do f0 at time n, right? People know what I'm getting at? Is that OK? So convolution of these two, evaluated at time t plus z2t. OK, so you can view this as the convolution of h2 with this shifted, scaled version of g. OK, so that's what I have when I write this here. I'm saying preserving the shifting and the scaling. OK, what's next? So that's this block. Let's do continuous time to discrete time. This is a lot simpler. And then on some level, you're just sampling. One question, though, before we do that. So we're going to sample y2, right? If y2 is band limited to minus f over 2 to f over 2, when we sample, we have no aliasing. Right? So we can just sample and not lose any information at all, actually. Like this would be a sufficient statistic for this in that case. That would be nice. Right? Here's my question to you. Is y2 band limited, do you think? Should I expect this to be band limited?
Yes.
Why?
That thing is round
OK. So band limited to this?
No, some scale.
Some scaled thing. So one issue is in the ComCloud at least, OK, and if you're designing the whole system with all the hardware, you could potentially sample at a higher rate here than here to accommodate the fact that things gotten fatter. ComCloud, we can't do that, right? Or at least, you can't oversample by a little bit. You can oversample by a lot. But if this is 44.1 kilohertz, you're probably going to do 44.1 kilohertz here, right? In which case, you need band limited to that, not including the flattened part. But let's assume we do sync. Okay, suppose the pulse is sync, in which case it's just band limited to minus f over 2 to f over 2. Would we expect, in that case, y2 to be band limited? I've got y2 over there, right? I expect it to be band limited? Yes? Yeah, we got the noise here. Who knows what the noise is doing? We haven't really talked about like the frequency spectrum of the noise. Okay, that's something you kind of need 4110 to really talk about properly. So we don't really talk about it in this class. Okay, but I can tell you right now, the noise is not band limited. Okay, in fact, the noise is a very wide band. Okay, so if you just blindly sample, at 44.1 kilohertz down here, you end up aliasing all the noise kind of on top of your signal. Bad idea. Okay. Moreover, if you're not using the sync pulse, you're aliasing this stuff back onto the signal. Bad idea. Okay, so in practice, you just low pass filter and then sample. Okay, you might be losing something with that, but at least you're not aliasing. Okay, so y2, not band limited to minus f over 2. So we low pass filter. So let's let G LPF for low pass filter just be like an ideal low-pass filter. Of course, in practice, it's not ideal, but for our modeling purposes, close enough. Okay, so use low-pass filter and then sample. So define y2 bar, let's say, of f to be y2 f times the low-pass filter, like that. Y2 is going to be x2f times h2f, so that gets multiplied by the low-pass filter, plus z2 times the low-pass filter, right? So there's low-pass filter y, so you end up low-passing filter your signal and the noise. And let's call this y2 bar of f. Okay, so if you go back to the time domain, you have x2 convolve with h2, convolve with the low-pass filter, impulse response, right? Plus the time domain low-pass filtered noise. Yeah?
What is the symbol with the LPF as the sub?
That's just this impulse, this transfer function right here. So this is defined to be the transfer function of an ideal low-pass filter from minus f/2 to f/2. So just define the system through its transfer function like that, and then apply it. Okay, so in words like rather than just blindly sampling, we're going to low-pass filter y to get this signal, and then we're going to sample this one.
What character is that supposed to be? Is that a G or like?
Oh, that's a G, yeah. I'm sorry, that's a capital G. Like that. Yeah, sorry. Okay, so then sample the low-pass filtered version. So y2 at time n, discrete time n, is going to be this thing sampled at rate 1/f. So that's y2 bar at time n/f. I'm going to put a plus tau here. Okay. So we'll come back to the tau in a moment. Okay, so then end to end, what we have, y2 n, it's going to be y2 bar, which is this. And I'm going to substitute for x2. Remember we had x2 in terms of its discrete time version, so plug that in here, then plug all of that in here. We have x2 of k, g of f dot minus k. You have that convolve with h2, right? Convolve with the low-pass filter. And then we're evaluating that at time, continuous time n/f plus tau, plus z2 bar of n/f plus tau. And we're just going to call that z of n, just defined to be z of n. Okay? So in this last step here, all I've done is like back substitute everything we've done, okay, to get a model from x2 discrete time to y2 discrete time, right here. Okay, so we've modeled from here to here. That's governed by this formula right here. Okay, let me comment on a couple of things. First of all, the tau. Why do I have this tau here? Where did that come from? Okay, so the way to think about the tau is, you have on the transmitter side, you have these like sample instance where the encoder has specified the voltage at that particular time, right? And it's interpolating, okay? And then at the receiver, it's sampling at particular times at rate 1/f, right? Okay? If you take tau to be 0, Okay, that would mean the 0 sample here is like perfectly lined up with the 0 sample here. That's sort of like tacitly assuming that the receiver is sampling right like this. But there's absolutely no guarantee that that will happen, right? It could happen more like this. Right? They could fall between like that, right? There's no common clock here. They're each just sampling on their own. Okay, so the samples are not necessarily like aligned with each other. Okay, the instant where the transmitter says, oh, the continuous time waveform has to pass right through this sample because that was specified by the wave file, like the instant where that happens is not necessarily an instant where the same instant where the receiver is sampling. Okay, they're sampling at roughly the same rate. Okay, it doesn't mean they're happening at exactly the same instant though, right? They can be kind of offset. So the tau is the offset. Okay. Two things. Let's talk about the noise. So I have this noise process, right? Zn as n varies. Okay, we need the distribution of this if you want a complete model and use it to study how to build a communication system for it. Okay, turns out one can show, you're going to find this probably rather hard to believe. Turns out you can show it's IAD, Gaussian, 0 mean, and some particular variance n. Okay, this is not at all obvious. Okay, we haven't talked about the physics of the thermal noise and the shot noise and how it's spread over frequency. Even if you understood that, bear in mind you're taking the noise, you're low pass filtering it, and then you're sampling it to get this discrete time signal. Okay, and the claim is you analyze all that, you get IAD Gaussian, right? That sounds almost too good to be true, right? In fact, it's true. It's a very good model, as we've set it up. It's a very good model. Okay, so to show it is possible to show this, using stuff that's not too far outside the realm of this class. You need some 4110 material to do it. I was hoping to make this one of the 567 homework problems later in the semester after people who are taking 4110 cover power spectral density and all that jazz. Okay, so this will be a theorem for us, but only the 567 students will show it, and probably not until the end of the semester when that stuff's covered. Okay, so that's the noise. Noise turns out beautifully. We couldn't hope for better, I think, in terms of analysis. Let's look at the deterministic side of this. Okay, this is a map. This is like a discrete time map, right? Or it's a map from discrete time signals to discrete time signals, right? The input is a discrete time signal, x2. This is all fixed, fixed, fixed. Okay, fixed, fixed parameters of the channel. So if you ignore the noise, here's my input. I got a bunch of stuff that's fixed by the channel. Here's my output. Okay, so this is a mapping from discrete time signals to discrete time signals. Okay, here's a question for you. Is that discrete time system linear? Is it time invariant? What do you think? What about linear? If I double x, do I double y? Ignoring the noise. If I double x, that doubles y, right? Okay, if you put the sum of two x's here, you're going to get the sum of the two corresponding y's here. Definitely linear, okay? Time invariance, not so apparent, I think. Okay, you want to know if you delay this signal by like 5 samples, let's delay this one by 5 samples. Okay, that is possible to show. That'll be a homework problem on homework 3. It's like 2 change of variables. Okay, so put k minus m here and do a change of variable to get the minus m out in here. So it turns out it is time invariant, and it's clearly linear. So LTI, okay, which means it must be possible to express y2 at time n as x2 discrete time convolution with some discrete time impulse response evaluated at time n plus the noise at time n, right? That must be possible, right? This is a discrete time LTI system that goes from here to here. So by golly, for any input, it must be possible to express its the corresponding output as the convolution of the input with the impulse response of that system. The impulse response of the system is going to be a mess. It's going to be some mix-up of, mash-up of all this stuff here. But mathematically, it exists. It's a function. It's just the discrete time impulse response. That's it. Yeah?
Are we assuming that the transmitter and receiver are being sampled at the same rate?
OK, excellent question. Excellent question. I intentionally swept that under the rug because I wanted to talk about it like after I made this point right here. So this is like a perfectly timed. If I were going to plant a question, I couldn't have planted it any better. OK, so this is indeed LTI up to this point. OK, but we are ignoring a few things. One is just the quantizations. We're not done yet. We've got blocks to go. Quantization, the clock skew, which is what you're asking about, and the finite length truncation. So I mean the fact that you've got like finite length vectors instead of these like doubly infinite in duration signals. So finite length truncation. OK, so since you asked about clock skew, let's talk about that right now. So I got two F's in here, right? There's an F and there's an F, right? If you trace back through your notes, OK, what you see is this F was the sampling rate at the transmitter. OK, so the transmitter had to interpolate these, it's just given a vector of samples, right? It has to kind of spread them out by 1/f time units and then interpolate. OK, that F, this F right here represents that spacing at the transmitter. OK, this F, on the other hand, this is the sampling rate at the receiver. Okay, so the receiver is trying to sample at rate 1/f, or actually sampling at rate f, so the spacing is 1/f. Okay, by putting f here and f here, we're tacitly assuming they are exactly the same. So there's no clock skew between the transmitter and the receiver. Okay, in reality, they're not the same. Okay, so you have like f1, f2, or ft and fr for transmitter and receiver. That would be more accurate. Okay, but we have kind of a fork in the road here modeling wise. Okay, I can put f1 and f2 there. That's another model. Okay, it's still linear if you do that. It's not time invariant anymore. You lose the time invariance when you do that. Okay, from a modeling perspective, that gives up a lot. Okay, because then the whole LTI system theory that we know and love, out the window, right? And that's a very powerful tool. It's an extremely powerful tool to use. Okay, so by putting separate sampling rates there, we give up a lot in terms of tractability. And arguably, it's not worth it. Okay, we give up too much and gain too little in terms of like fidelity to reality. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to keep the sampling rates the same. We're going to put f there and f, f here and f here. So our model will be LTI. Okay, but we got to keep in our minds that that's sort of a fudge that we made in order to keep the model tractable. Okay, and we need to be aware that the model is kind of missing something potentially kind of important. And the way to, I think the thing to really keep in your mind is, as you saw in lab 1, the clock skew is really only noticeable over long time horizons, right? So how far apart are the clocks? One part in what? 10 to the 6 or 10 to the 5 in that order? That's a useful number to have stored in your head for this semester. Okay, the clock skew is about 1 part in 10 to the 5 or 1 part in 10 to the 6, on that order. Okay, so I can tell you, if you're observing the channel over something that's a period of time that's significantly shorter than that, okay, like, not 10 to the 5 samples or 10 to the 6 samples, but just like 10,000 samples. Okay, so like a fraction of a second for 44.1 kilohertz sampling rate. Okay, then you will not tend to see the clock difference, right? The clocks are close enough that you can only kind of see the difference. You only see them separating from each other after you wait a good 100,000 samples or more. That's like a couple seconds at 44.1 kilohertz, right? Okay, so the way to think about this is this model is valid so long as you're not looking at like really long time horizons. Okay, if you're looking at time horizons on the order of like half a second, maybe up to a second, this is a reasonable model. Okay, once you go beyond that, okay, then the fact that the sampling rates are actually different starts to kind of rear its head, and this model becomes less and less accurate. Okay, and that will influence how we design systems. Okay, so when we design communication systems, what we'll do is we'll kind of use the channel for like a fixed period and apply this model, and then we'll kind of just start over and use it for another fixed period and apply this model again. Okay, and the idea being that over each of these little periods, the system looks LTI enough, okay, that we can apply this model and have it be reasonably accurate. Okay, so bottom line is, in reality, this F is not the same as this F, but we're going to fudge it in the name of tractability. Okay, so that's clock. It's how we handle clocks. It's how we handle clock skew. We just sort of ignore it, you know, in the math model, but then we just store in our heads that it's in the background. You got to keep it in mind. Okay, so we didn't quite finish today. So on Tuesday, there's not much left though. These steps go quickly. Quantization is not a lot to say about. Infinite length truncation goes quickly too. So we'll do these on Tuesday, and then we'll start talking about how to build encoders and decoders. See you Tuesday.